The Nintendo 64 is a platform I have discussed on this channel a number of times for years now. In 2018, the Nintendo 64 is a polarizing system. Many people praised the platform and hold it up on a pedestal as one of the greatest games consoles of all time. I think I have probably lost count now of the amount of people from the general public I have spoken to who have been pretty convinced that Goldeneye is the greatest game of all time, and nothing in any genre has ever touched it ever since. Since this statement probably sounds ridiculous to most more cultured gamers amongst us, this has to be a complete myth, right? Surely the Nintendo 64 and its library of games is not that good. The general hyperbole surrounding games like GoldenEye and Mario Kart 64 has somewhat soured my attitude to the Nintendo 64 over the years, as the claims I have heard around the system's library have quite frankly been ridiculous at times. The level of nonsense and blind fanboyism I see in support of the Nintendo 64 has put me off making an in-depth video on the platform up until this day. But believe it or not, before all of this incessant annoyance around apparently how great the Nintendo 64 was, I was at one time as huge a fan as anyone else of the platform. In fact, many moons ago, I was one of these screeching fanatics myself. So, over the last 2 decades, I have either grown up a lot and can see things a lot more partially, or I have become a grumpy old git. In order to explore this further, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to take you on a trip down memory lane, discussing my early experiences with the Nintendo 64, looking at some of the games, the system's global history, and most importantly, looking at whether or not the Nintendo 64 is still worth playing today. Yeah! Time to look at the once world's most powerful games console. We shall start by looking at how the system came into existence. As is generally the format with Nintendo, the Nintendo 64 was more or less ready in 1995. However, release was delayed until 1996, when Time, arguably one of the most influential magazines in the world, named it the Machine of the Year. When being released into a market where it was going to be competing with the PS1 and the Sega Saturn, you can become hard pressed to find better promotion, especially on the basis that the SNES had unfortunately suffered in sales a little. Not due to being a bad console in any way, shape or form, but more because production had been affected by the Japanese recession. Despite this, Nintendo still remained dominant in the console market, and the Nintendo 64 was going to be the product which solidified the company's position while simultaneously nipping newcomers Sony and Sega at the ankles. During the years leading up to and including development of the N64, a highly decorated company specialising in graphics and supercomputing came knocking on the door of both Sega and Nintendo. That company was called Silicon Graphics Incorporated, or SGI for short. What they offered was a CPU which operated in a manner far superior to their competitors, at a fraction of the power and half of the price, the chips retailing at approximately $40 US. The reason for this is because they wanted to move into a market which would turn over a lot more products much quicker, and after a slightly unsuccessful meeting with Sega, SGI would set their eyes on Nintendo. This would end up being a much more fruitful meeting than what happened with Sega. The reasons for this is because although Sega were very impressed with the technology on offer, they wanted exclusive rights to it. Nintendo, on the other hand, didn't ask for this. SGI also felt that Nintendo had a great reputation for driving volumes into the market, and therefore offered a considerably more profitable union between the companies. In 1993, the two companies officially announced to the world their joint project, with SGI proclaiming a project tailor-made just for Nintendo, to be released in 1994 in arcades, and then to be released in the home console market in 1995, and would be sold for under $250. Despite the delay to the following 2 years for the home console's release, they remained true to their word with the price, with the console being marketed at $199. Again, similar to when we all knew the Switch as the NX, the N64 was initially announced under a different name, the Ultra 64, which sounds like the natural progression from proclaiming a system as Super, I suppose. Anyway, they had to drop the Ultra part of the name as they were concerned about legal action from Konami, as they owned a smaller company developing under the name of Ultra Games. But anyway, finally the N64 made it to the shops worldwide. Working on launch titles for the Ultra 64 was an elite group of developers, many of which we all know and adore. Nintendo lovingly named this group as the Dream Team, and they included, once I take a deep breath, the game development team for SGI, Alias Research Incorporated, Software Creations, Rambus Incorporated, Multigen Incorporated, everyone's beloved Rare and Rare Coin It, Toys and Games Incorporated, WMS Industries, Acclaim Entertainment, Paradigm Simulation, Spectrum Holobyte, DMA Design, Angel Studios, Time Warner Interactive, and finally, Mindscape for you. One of the huge benefits to Nintendo about working with SGI is that their forecasts with regards to the CPU's performance was that they were actually very accurate. I mean, have you ever really heard of any games which didn't use the system to its full capabilities? The Dream Team were very fortunate that they were able to begin developing their prototypes off the back of the estimations supplied to them by SGI, which all turned out to be very accurate. An example of this is that LucasArts were able to port their Star Wars game prototype to the console hardware in only 3 days. Now, I don't know much about this kind of thing, but I am told that's very impressive. Apparently. An interesting aspect of the marketing was that this was the world's first 64-bit gaming system, and many marketing sources claim the technology within was actually more powerful than that used in the moon landing computers at NASA. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because Atari had already claimed this accolade with the Jaguar. However, technically, this isn't necessarily true. The Jaguar uses a general 64-bit architecture which works alongside 2 32-bit RISC processors, the number of which adds to 64. So I guess that was their angle. You know, Jaguar, do the math. Cheeky, eh? Either way, the best 64 will always be the Commodore, as we all know, in the same way that the Spectrum's 48K is better than the PlayStation 4 Pro's wimpy 4K, eh? True to the promises made when Nintendo and SGI announced they were working together in the second quarter of 1994, Nintendo created another alliance with Midway, the kings of arcades. They created a joint venture called Williams Nintendo, which would lead on to the creation of Killer Instinct and Cruis'n USA. These 2 games were boasted to be the debut games using the arcade technology using the Nintendo 64 platform. The main difference was going to be that it was going to be using a hard drive and a ROM's chips instead of carts. The result would be impressive for the time. For example, Killer Instinct had 3D characters which were pre-rendered into 2D form, with CG movie backgrounds, which streamed directly onto a hard drive and contained animations as the characters moved horizontally across the screen. In regards to the system's delay in release, the Nintendo 64 was formally revealed to the public in Japan in November of 1995. Being highly anticipated, there was allegedly hordes of school children huddled in the cold outside with electricity of anticipation clearly ripping through their ranks. However, although it was due to be released in time for Christmas that year, the console was held back until April of 1996. Although this may sound concerning, the anticipation was so high it actually affected sales of the Saturn and PS1 during Christmas at that time. Whilst all this was going on, back in old jolly old England, I was just a small child in junior school. I was a proud owner of a Super Nintendo, and I couldn't wait for the system's sequel to be released. The Super Nintendo was a massive part of my childhood, and I loved the platform so much that I ignored the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation purely on the basis that I believed that when the Ultra 64 was to come along, that it would blow its competition completely out of the water. So why bother with the crappy 32-bit platforms? They would probably go the same way as the Jaguar, Mega CD and 3DO after all. Now the reasons behind the delay are very typical of Nintendo. They advised that they needed to let the system mature a little bit more, and it also gave more time for the Dream Team to be able to iron out any snags they might have had on their games and potentially begin development of some more. A former SGI employee, Adrian Safati, advised differently however. He claimed SGI themselves were not happy with the chips they were providing for the CPU, claiming they needed to be redesigned as they had underperformed during testing. It would be released in early 1996 as the Windows-based partner Nintendo 64 by Kyoto Microcomputers Limited of Japan. With regards to the even later releases for the platform for everywhere outside of Japan, Nintendo were well aware of the risk. The reason they delayed was because they were concerned they were not going to be able to keep up with the platform's demand if they released worldwide simultaneously. So, in order to prevent fans from growing impatient and buying the Saturn or PS1, they regularly released teaser adverts with slogans such as "Wait for it" and "Is it worth waiting for? Only if you want the best." Retrospectively, I guess this must have been some pretty effective marketing in some cases, as I was one of the children who clearly fell for this nonsense. Prior to writing this video, I just assumed I was a child with his head screwed well on, who was capable of making informed choices. But nope, it looks like the Big N managed to brainwash me using their evil corporate marketing strategies. This is the same clutches in which many fanboys cannot even escape to this very day. After the outrageous amount of pomp and pageantry, the Nintendo 64 was finally released in Japan on the 23rd of June 1996. As it has enjoyed so much hype, the 300,000 units which have been produced sold out entirely on the launch day. With this launch, they made a point of selling the Nintendo 64 in many more stores than they did previously with their release of the Super Famicom, which had created utter bedlam for the stores which were involved. Nintendo held back an additional 200,000 units, which was sold out too between the 26th of June and the 30th of June 1996. During this time, Nintendo experienced a few very quick sales in North America as well prior to the official release. There were some sales taking place in America where the console was selling for nearly $700. This figure didn't actually include the shipping either, though scummy sellers were charging for the import. When the console received its official launch, it was with only two launch titles for America, Pilot Wing 64 and Super Mario 64. The marketing, unlike for the PS1 and the Saturn, which had been targeted towards teenagers and adults, for the Nintendo 64 it had been targeted towards children and families. The price was also originally going to be $250, however was sold at $199 as Sony and Sega had dropped their prices to the same in anticipation of the 64. Now, in regards to my own story regarding the Nintendo 64, I had seen a lot of imagery of Super Mario 64 in the build-up. The look of the game literally blew my mind. I had no concept in my head in how I could control a character in a 3D environment. The game looked so technologically advanced to anything I had ever seen before. It just reinforced all of my views on why it was so important to wait for this system. My only worry was whether or not the game would control badly due to the jump from 2D to 3D. I never got the platform on launch, but I had the opportunity to play the system very shortly after release. I remember playing on a demo unit outside of Dixon's in Gatwick Airport, whilst waiting for a flight to Greece. I remember that day playing Mario Kart 64 against my brother on the racetrack that looks like a beach. Once again, I remember being thoroughly impressed with the graphics, but I remember struggling at the time playing with an analog stick for the first time. It actually kind of felt like we had stepped backwards a little bit to me, as it reminded me of the sticks I had played with in arcades years earlier, which I always found more difficult to use. Later I would learn that my issues with the analog stick were mostly teething problems, although I thought this little anecdote was fairly important, as it is not something I hear people really raise much today regarding their Nintendo 64 memories. The transition from 2D to full 3D was all rather surreal. Moving on, I got a Nintendo 64 of my very own on Christmas Day of 1997. This day is probably one of my all-time favourite Christmases, right up there with playing Donkey Kong Country and Shenmue for the first time. Two other gaming experiences which totally blew my mind. That day I was lucky enough to receive the console with 4 games, which all in all delivered a breathtaking experience that morning. The first game I played was Mario 64, a revolutionary game which played just as good as it looked. Sure, it may be ugly and blocky today, and even the controls are a little bit slippery in comparison to modern 3D Mario games. However, this game is still just as fun to play today as it was back then. Mario 64 was the perfect showcase to show off what the 64 could do in its early days, and exactly what the Nintendo 64 was capable of. Playing this game for the first time in 1997 felt surreal and magical. So, if others have memories this good, it would make sense why such hyperbole has grown around the platform over the years. That same day I got to play Mario Kart 64, this time from the comforts of my own home. My standout memory that day with the game was playing Toad's Turnpike for the first time, or was it Turnpike, I think. To be playing Mario Kart in a 3D environment surrounded by other traffic on the road was awe-inspiring. However, this was only where the fun started, as later that day I was playing 4-player multiplayer with my brother, uncle and cousin. The multiplayer arm to the Nintendo 64 is another reason the system is so fondly remembered. However, we will get to this in more detail later on. Next up, that day I played Lilac Wars, a game known in some countries as Starfox 64. Previously I'd loved playing Star Wing, so this game was my perfect cup of tea. To this day, this may be my personal favourite game on the platform, and I even went to the effort of collecting every medal in difficult mode of this game. I even went as far as sending my high scores into Nintendo official magazine. The game was just like its Super Nintendo counterpart, but just a lot more refined and with actual voice acting, which was impressive in itself back in the day. Finally, game number 4 was Killer Instinct Gold. Whilst this game is a decent fighter, and probably the best fighter on the entire platform, if you do not count Smash, Killer Instinct Gold was not quite as impressive as the other games. Personally, I enjoyed Killer Instinct 2 a lot more, which I had the pleasure of playing on holiday in Florida a few months prior. Then again, I suppose I should give the game the benefit of the doubt, as this was the period where consoles were still chasing the arcade, and I suppose Gold has aged a lot better visually than most of the rest of the other Nintendo 64 games. So, that was my first day as a Nintendo 64 owner. The platform had delivered to me a perfect beginning, and I couldn't wait to see what was coming next. However, I would soon learn that as a Nintendo 64 owner, I would have to wait going forward for literally everything. A few weeks after Christmas that year was my birthday, and there was no other content on the market that particularly tickled my fancy. So instead of grabbing a game I really wanted, I had to settle for, Bomberman 64. My experiences with this game were okay, and due to my lack of titles for the system, I played this game to death. I even went to the effort of collecting the 100 gold cards and unlocking the final levels. I really did get my money's worth with this one. I suppose this game is okay really, and certainly stands out a lot from other 3D platformers of the period. The multiplayer though is a bit crap, which is a shame really, considering how well known multiplayer is on the Nintendo 64. Next month was my brother's birthday, and he decided to bring ISS 64 to the household. Another game I played the hell out of for the sake of it, just because there wasn't much 64 content around my house yet. The standout feature for me with this one was the hilariously bad commentary that sticks out in my head right up until this very day. Still though, a decent football game for its time. Throughout the next couple of years, releases on the Nintendo 64 were slow. The release pace was nowhere near as good as the Super Nintendo previously, and couldn't match that of its competition, the Sony PlayStation. I remember in the early days of my Nintendo 64 ownership, I would become increasingly jealous of my friend's PlayStation. Many games on the platform were starting to become very cheap, and you could get PlayStation Platinum games for as little as £20. On top of all of this too, they got to sample brand new games every single month as demo discs which would come attached to magazines. The only way I, on the other hand, could play modern games was if I forked out a whole £60 whenever I wanted something new. In some aspects I was starting to re-evaluate my choice of bypassing the PlayStation, as it seemed like a lot of my friends just seemed to have a much wider array of choice. One game, however, that made me ecstatic to be a Nintendo 64 owner, and I am sure it will be the same case for many others, was during the release of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. This was a defining game for Christmas of 1998 to me, and still to this day is my favourite Zelda game of all time. It basically took everything that made Link to the Past great and took it into a 3D environment. Like many, this is easily one of my favourite games ever made, and many people's defining Nintendo 64 memory. Another game from the period was Yoshi Story, a game I anticipated due to the serious lack of 2D greatness on the Nintendo 64 platform. 3D was great and all, and something entirely new, but it didn't make any sense whatsoever to almost completely throw away everything that had been built up and established before it. So a return to 2D gameplay was welcomed with open arms to my bedroom. However, I must say, with Yoshi Story, I was ultimately disappointed. Yoshi's Island on the Super Nintendo was one of the greatest 2D side-scrollers ever made, so I was expecting something even better on the 64. Mario, Zelda and Starfox all delivered, so I just assumed Yoshi would join the club. Sadly though, this is a much smaller, more watered down game than that of Yoshi's Island, and I felt short-changed in many ways after spending my birthday money on this one. In regards to the system itself, as we all know, the Nintendo 64 offered dated old cartridge-based technology as opposed to CD-based technology like that of its competition. For us consumers, this offered one huge benefit, which was the lack of load times. However, everything else about these cartridges kind of sucked, and in later life I was to learn that the cartridges were the very reason the 64 lacked in content to that of its competition. These cartridges were inferior to CDs in many ways. For example, they were extremely expensive to manufacture, which meant most big publishers at the time, like Squaresoft, Capcom and many others, either released a limited amount of games for the 64 or didn't bother releasing their games on the platform whatsoever. CDs were just far more appetizing for developers, especially when you take into account the level of extra storage they offered in comparison to that of CDs. So overall, the Nintendo 64 may have been more powerful than the Sony PlayStation, but in many ways a lot of games superior on the older PlayStation. These system limitations led to the 64 ultimately receiving an extremely small library. However, the platform is still fondly remembered today for some of the quality gems the console brought to the table. When it is all said and done, though, I would say the Nintendo 64 is most fondly remembered for one aspect perhaps more than any other, and that was the system's 4 controller ports that allowed local multiplayer. At the end of the 90s, the Nintendo 64 was the ultimate party machine, and no games console previously had ever delivered such an in-depth multiplayer experience. People's memories of playing games like Mario Kart 64 with their friends is perhaps the largest factor in providing the insane level of nostalgia many individuals hold for the system. So now let me recap for you some of the most well-remembered multiplayer games on the system. The big one, what everyone seems to remember the most, was Goldeneye, a rare case where a game based on a film was actually good for a change. The single player mode was sublime in its own right for the period. However, it is the multiplayer that kept people coming back to the game with their friends time and time again. You could argue that Goldeneye is a game that popularised the first-person shooter genre, and that it's partially responsible for the popularity of games like Call of Duty and Battlefield today. Sure, we had games like Doom and Wolfenstein before it, but I am sure Goldeneye had more people huddled around the TV shooting each other more than ever before in history. Another massive game that offered great multiplayer and single player modes was Diddy Kong Racing, a kart racer in which was a decent challenger to Mario Kart 64's throne. This game innovated the genre in many ways, as it offered a hub world and collectibles, much like the 3D platformer Mario 64. Apart from karts, the game also let you race using planes and hovercrafts too, giving the game even more variation than Mario Kart. It is pretty much debated to this day whether or not Diddy Kong Racing is better than Mario Kart 64, and personally I'm still undecided. The 64 also hosted the first 3 Mario Party games of the trilogy that has personally always irritated me due to the lack of single player depth and more importantly the game's lack of fairness when it comes to playing with friends. The game has a large element of randomness to them, which detracts from the fun of trying to play with any amount of skills in my opinion. I suppose that's maybe what the game's about, letting everyone be equal despite skill. Bit rubbish for a game, I suppose. Super Smash Bros. Also debuted on the Nintendo 64 and was an innovative breath of fresh air within the fighting genre. However, more importantly than that, it just felt mind-blowing at the time to be able to play as all of Nintendo's biggest characters, all in the same game. The collision of worlds was an exciting experience, and to be able to play this game with 4 players added an extra layer of fun. In terms of multiplayer games, it is also hard not to mention Pokemon. The Pokemon Stadium games were great as they were compatible with the Game Boy entries in the series and offered a bunch of different features on top. Battling with 3D polygons for the first time was all sorts of epic, but equally important was the game's mini-games, which were all great fun to play in their own right, especially with friends. I must say though, it felt really criminal not to get a full Pokemon RPG on the Nintendo 64. What was that all about? It was the hottest Nintendo property of the era, so it was really sad to not see a main series entry and only get one on the inferior 8-bit platform instead. Still though, I suppose we got Pokemon Snap, which was an extremely unique game for the era, especially when you take into account that this was many years before the social media photo-obsessed period of history. Yuck. It was just a shame that the game was so short and lacked much of a variety in terms of Pokemon. Whilst throughout the Nintendo 64's life cycle there were plenty of decent games to play, the main issue I always had was they seemed to be drip feeding us games, and when they were released they were just so bloody expensive in comparison to any other games on the market. Even moving into the bloody Dreamcast era, you could get Dreamcast games cheaper than you could get new Nintendo 64 games, which was pretty crazy when you think about it. In fact, the lack of content and the cheap price of CD-based games soon led me to purchasing a PlayStation myself in 1999. After 2 years with the Nintendo 64, there simply was not enough content on the platform to keep me a happy gamer. I needed more, and the Sony PlayStation offered more variety and at a cheaper price. Going forward, I suppose I had the best of both worlds, as I got to have regular doses of gaming content, yet I could still play the occasional Nintendo 64 game whenever they were released. So let's look at some of the other titles on the platform I enjoyed. Banjo-Kazooie was refreshing at the time, as it felt like a really well done love letter to Mario 64. The game looked similar and played similar, but still had enough charm to stand on its own 4 legs. My only issue with Banjo is that Rare seemed to overdo it on the cutesy 3D platformer front. As we soon got Donkey Kong 64, Banjo-Tooie and Conker's Bad Fur Day, which overall was overkill. Personally for me, these games just all felt a bit samey, and I got less enjoyment out of each entry. I still got my fair share of fun out of Banjo-Kazooie though, and this was before the 3D platforming genre had been run into the ground. Another selection of games we got were from the Star Wars franchise. The standout to me was Star Wars Rogue Squadron, which was a brilliant supplement to the original trilogy of films. The year I got this game was certainly one of my better birthdays. However, the game made me crave a Star Wars Episode 7 really badly. I suppose some dreams do come true. Thankfully, the greatest film of all time, The Phantom Menace, also received a couple of games to supplement it. Most importantly, Star Wars Pod Racing, which was a fantastic Fast and Furious racer. In fact, it reminded me a lot of F-Zero X, another great game on the platform, which I have somehow forgotten to talk about up until this point, so Pod Racing and F-Zero are both two great space racers. Play them both. The best game on the platform, Ocarina of Time, thankfully saw a sequel on the system in the form of Majora's Mask. Whilst the game may not be in the Ocarina's league in my opinion, the game is still a unique, innovative experience in its own right. Personally, I didn't really like it at the time, as all I really wanted was another Ocarina of Time. About 10 years later though, I made an effort to play through the game, and now I appreciate the game a little more than I did back then. You have got to love that moon, right? Nearer the end of the system's life cycle, I ditched buying new games for the platform altogether, as my pocket money would get spent on the Sega Dreamcast and PlayStation 2's library of games instead, for my gaming indulgence. However, I still got to experience the final few games in their prime, by borrowing them from a school friend. One I thoroughly enjoyed was Paper Mario. What a great JRPG experience that was, and nearly as good as the time I spent with Final Fantasy IX, around the same sort of time frame. If only they made Paper Mario games this good in 2018. Wouldn't that be nice? Moving on to the next generation of consoles, the Nintendo 64's greatest legacy of all was certainly its multiplayer. So the GameCube, the Dreamcast and the original Xbox all emulated the system by offering 4 controller ports of their own. Whilst people continued to have their local multiplayer experiences with these other platforms, the craze slowly died out and was replaced with people's much more solitary online gaming experiences instead. Ugh. Something I have never bothered with really, as I could never really see the point in it all. When people talk about multiplayer gaming being its best, people always harken back to the glory days of the Nintendo 64 and reminisce about all the fun they had in their youths. In fact, I hear this narrative pushed so frequently, even amongst my own social circle, that last week I decided to host a Nintendo 64 party on Twitch. I wanted to test whether Nintendo 64 games were as good as they were remembered, or whether it was just a bunch of hyperbolic nonsense. So, after an evening of Nintendo 64, my friends seemed to overall conclude that the system hasn't aged all too that well. The graphics are ugly, the controls are a bit clunky, the frame rates in multiplayer games are all slow, and I suppose in a way that it illustrates that some things are just best left alone. Because in most cases, reality never seems to live up to the hype of nostalgia. From all of these dated multiplayer experiences though, we still had an insane amount of fun from one game. And that game was WWF No Mercy. For once, this was a multiplayer game that has truly aged like a fine wine, and it is just as fun to play today as it was back on release. Overall, just such a trashy, ridiculous title, where the ugly, blocky graphics tend to add to the gaming experience rather than take away from it. So ladies and gentlemen, if you must attempt Nintendo 64 multiplayer in 2018, my hot pick for you is WWF No Mercy. Yeah. In terms of my final look back at history, the Sony PlayStation absolutely crushed the Nintendo 64. selling over triple the amount of units Nintendo managed to shift with their platform. The Sony PlayStation was superior to the Nintendo 64 in the majority of ways. However, if you lived in the 90s, the Nintendo 64 still offered some unique experiences like Ocarina of Time, Mario 64, but most importantly it was the king of the multiplayer. So, to answer my final question on whether or not the Nintendo 64 is worth playing today, I guess I would say probably. Many of the games on the system have received superior ports or sequels on other systems now, but it is always worth going back to see what a game looks and feels like on its original hardware, even if it's sometimes just to see how far we have come. The graphics in most cases haven't aged very well, and the split screen multiplayer games may not look as good as you remember them. However, there is no question that the platform is still worth playing. The library is tiny compared to most of the biggest consoles of all time, but at least what we can find on the Nintendo 64 is a lot of quality over quantity. Sure, the Nintendo 64 is no Sega Mega Drive, Sony PlayStation or Super Nintendo, but the platform still carries around a unique level of charm in its own right. Personally, after going on this epic Nintendo 64 journey, I still feel the system is somewhat overrated. But it is obviously overrated due to the outrageous amount of people who still seem to absolutely adore this thing. So I suppose that this gives the system more gravitas than many others. In terms of gaming history, I'd rank this console smack down in the middle in terms of quality, below most of the best-selling consoles of our period, and above most of the lesser popular consoles like the Jaguar and 3DO for example. So the Nintendo 64 was a great product in its heyday, and an okay-ish one to go back to today, to have a blast on. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed my video about the Nintendo 64. What are your favourite Nintendo 64 games and memories? Let me know in my comments section. Also, if you're either new or old to this channel, I would greatly appreciate it if you could hit the notification bell, as the recent YouTube subscriber feeds to the algorithm have affected how often my videos are viewed these days. So if you actually want to see my content, the notification bell is by far the best way for you to find it in 2018. I strongly urge you to click that button now. Finally, my channel Top Hat Gaming Man is partly funded from the fantastic support and donations I receive from my lovely Patreon benefactors. You people literally are the bloodstream of this channel. So shout outs to Carl Johnson, Shizuka Kobayashi, Richard Clark, Michael Keneally, Greg Hooper, Harold Webb, Sint Spacies, Kevin Verheely, David Mountford, Andrew Bazansky, Atanas Garcia, Edward O'Reilly, Peter Sadul, Recount Archaeology, Mark S. Hines, and all of my other patrons. I would really struggle to make these videos without all of your kindness. If you too would like to support this channel, then make sure you check out my Patreon page. There's some nice little rewards there as well. Cheerio!